welcome everyone. Back at it again this morning. We have a pretty stacked lineup in this room. So this morning, first up, we have Peter Gutmann, who has been coming to the AusCert conference for quite a fair few number of years. And I've also had the pleasure of seeing the first part of this talk at KawaiiCon last year, and he's assured me that there's even extra to add on to the talk, so get ready. So Peter, when a new zero-day vulnerability comes knocking, we have to jump to noisy and sensitive production systems to do digging for indications of compromise. With a simulated copy of production environments in a public sandbox, we can easily extend malicious probing from legitimate traffic and investigating successful attacks with operational sensitivity. That's some of the wrong info. But I was reading this abstract before and I'm like, this doesn't line up with what I'm talking about. We're talking about why quantum cryptanalysis is bollocks, not that. So before I make much more of a fool of myself, can I please get a massive round of applause for Peter Gutmann?
So I always like putting a bit of history in my talks. So this device is called Gustav. It was proposed in 1935 for use against the Maginot Line. Like all government projects, it was late, so it wasn't ready until 1942. And 80 years ago, this was the headline-grabbing attack. So this thing weighed 1,350 tons. It fired a 5-ton shell, 50 kilometers, and it left a crater 10 meters wide and deep. So this was where all the action was. And everyone who was anyone wanted to be associated with this thing because it was just cool. So that's the good stuff. The downside is it was carried in a 1.5 kilometer long freight train with 25 freight cars. That was just the gun itself. The supplies and the crew and the ammunition required their own freight trains. It took, there's lots of different reports about this, 2,000 men, 4,000 men, 4,500 men. To get into operation, it took about 5 weeks to do. One of the things that they had to do was build the twins reinforced railway tracks that this thing had to run on. It had 2 entire flak battalions to defend it. In its entire operational lifetime, it fired about 50 shells against Sevastopol, which is the Russian port in the Crimea. And again, there's lots of conflicting reports over exactly what happened. So one of the targets was Fort Maxim Gorky, and what the Russians had done is they'd taken a pre-World War I battleship turrets and hauled them up to the top of the hills surrounding Sevastopol and put them in concrete emplacements. And the supergun fired 13 shots at it. Every single one of them missed, some by quite a large margin. Maxim Gorky responded with about 600 shots of its own, most of which did not miss. And they eventually they stopped firing because they ran out of ammunition. So the fort wasn't actually defeated, they simply ran out of ammunition. So ballistics experts had warned before the supergun was even developed that you're going to have a very high shot dispersal. But they were basically ignored. A lot of the shots fell hundreds of meters from the target. And you're going to prove that size really can't make up for projectile dysfunction. But the fort was eventually destroyed with satchel charges. So if you see photos of this destroyed fort, that wasn't the German gun that did that. That was engineers who ran up with demolition charges and actually demolished it. So this whole thing was a considerable net loss for the war effort. It drew resources away from the main attack to get this thing running. You could have done the same thing with a handful of aircraft. The gun actually had an entire squadron of spotter aircraft that went in to spot the shells, where the shells fell. Probably a fairly boring job. It's missed, missed again. Ooh, almost hit us, but still missed. And they actually had these things called Richtling shells, which today they'd be called bunker busters, which could have done the same job, fired from completely standard artillery. They never needed this supergun. So surely we wouldn't be doing the same thing today, focusing on these fancy attacks that aren't very practical. So what are the threats we're facing today? So in the security field, we've actually got pretty good data on where the problems are. That's the OWASP top 10. So OWASP stands for Open Source Foundation for Application Security. This would have actually made a good question for the quiz yesterday. What does OWASP stand for? And they've pretty much stayed the same. You can see some movement in there. But that's because they've grouped categories differently and renamed some things and recategorized them. But basically, the OWASP top 10 are pretty consistent over the entire time they've been running. And there's various subcategories. For example, APIs have their own top 10. And again, they're all pretty consistent over time. There's some renamings, reclassifications, but it's pretty consistent. And these things are remarkably stable. OWASP did a 20th anniversary of their top 10 vulnerabilities and problems, and they're pretty much unchanged given the changing in classification and naming and so on. So the underlying problems have remained the same throughout the last 20 years and more. And if you really want to get into this in detail, you can get spreadsheets showing all the, tracking all the changes and the renamings and so on. And this issue is widespread across different security measures. So there was the Computing Research Association, and in 2003 they created this thing called Grand Challenges in Trustworthy Computing, or what it would be now is computer security. And I'll let you read the challenges, but it's, within a decade, eradicate widespread viral spam and DOS attacks. Create a framework to provide end users with comprehensible security. Create and implement models and tools to manage risks. So this is their grand challenge within the next 10 years, is eradicate viruses, spam, and so on. They did a retrospective in 2023, and they asked the panel that did the original one, how are we doing? And many participants said that not a single challenge was met. And in fact, given how much better the attacks have gotten, we've actually moved backwards in the categories 1 and 2. So to give an example of what the threat landscape is, these are the top, based on the number of distinct vulnerabilities, these are the top things with the count of number of vulnerabilities. And the two things I've circled there are applications, so they're web browsers. So basically you've got an application that has more vulnerabilities than an entire operating system. So this is the threat environment that we're operating in. But what gets all the attention? Well, if you look at the OWASP top 100,000 from the appendix to the addendum to the supplement to the Apocrypha, you'll see things like this, so Spectre, Poodle, Meltdown, Rowhammer, that sort of thing. Is there anyone here who has not heard of at least one of these? Okay, so you've all heard of them. Now, what do all these things have in common? No one ever uses them, because there are 17,244 easier ways to carry out the attack. That's why. So these have actually been referred to as stunt cryptography, because that's pretty much what it is. So a typical stunt cryptography attack, the way to identify one of these, stunt cryptography is you've got a 0.0001% chance of recovering 2 bits of plaintext from one message. Any one of the OWASP top 10, you've got a 100% chance of recovering the plaintext of all the messages. And that's why no one bothers with these, because every other attack is better. But people really like these fancy headline-grabbing attacks. And I've been asking this, or variations of this question for a while in different venues. Does anyone know of any actual cases of a real-world attacker using Spectre, Rowhammer, Poodle, anything like that? Yeah. So basically focusing on these high-profile attacks that no one ever uses is sort of like obsessing over superguns. It draws resources away from the actual things we're supposed to be addressing, which is the top 10, onto these attacks that no one cares about. So we've got lots of cases where we've actually got very good measurements on what to do. So it's, we've got the OWASP top 10 is statistical. It's simply these are the top vulnerabilities that are being exploited. So specifically in cryptography, we've also got lots of statistics. So for example, for RSA key sizes or factorization, or factoring. So that's a graph of all the results since pretty much the first time that anyone's published results as factoring against RSA attacks. And it's beautiful, from a statistical point of view. You can just draw a straight line through that. And you can then say, I've got a 1,000-bit key. How long will that be secure? Or to 2040. Or the other way around, I want to be secure in 2040. I'll use a 1,000-bit key. You just read off the line on the graph. Now, you're going to think, okay, we can actually technically break 1,000-bit keys today. And yes, we can with one of those things. So it takes about a year's work to break one single 1,000, or to factor a single 1,000-bit key on that class of machine. So let's explore this a bit. Let's say you work for the NSA and you go up to your boss and you say, there's this 1,000-bit key I'd like to factor. And your boss says, okay, tell me more. And you say, well, it's pretty straightforward. We just need to shut down Los Alamos for an entire year, and then we can recover this one key. And then your boss looks at you like they expect a cuckoo to pop out of your forehead on a spring or something like that. But let's make it more applicable to individuals. Let's say I've got this magic black box I give you, and I tell you this black box will factor a 1,000-bit key in 1 year. To prove your dedication to this, you have to agree to live on a desert island by yourself. No internet, no TV, no radio, no Netflix, no companions. You're basically a hermit. And then once a month you get this airdrop of cans of baked beans. It's a desert island, so it doesn't matter what you're eating there. And a replacement butane cartridge to keep you going. And you live as a hermit for a year to break this single 1,000-bit key. Who would accept this offer? Does anyone know of a 1,000-bit key that's worth breaking, that you would live in isolation for a year in exchange for recovering this 1,000-bit key? And again, yeah, I'm not seeing any hands. So informal polling has indicated that, as with shutting down Los Alamos for a year, there just aren't any keys that are worth spending a year of effort to recover. And so because there were no rational attacks, that might be why we've switched to numerology. So this is from NIST. So this is a sort of a spreadsheet of symmetric algorithms, so AES, whatever, versus public key algorithms or asymmetric crypto. So if you've got, so you can look up on the spreadsheet, you can say I've got a key size of this for AES 128. The matching key size for RSA is 3,000 bits. So where do these figures come from? So the practical limits on achievable computation are about 2 to the 110. This is basically physics. You know, you can get people who've done calculations on this. We need to convert the entire Earth's silicon into CPUs and then hook the sun up to the Earth to power it and stuff. So basically, it's a hard physical limit of about 2 to the 110. So that means for all of the symmetric encryption algorithms, starting with DES, or triple DES, so in its DES form, that's a half-century old algorithm, 112 bits. AES 128, AES 192, AES 256, they're all identical. They're all beyond the 110-bit event horizon. So in terms of security, they're all equally unbreakable. But numerology requires that we treat these as being distinct. So for symmetric crypto, each time you add a bit, it doubles the work factor. For asymmetric crypto, which is the public key encryption, it's not nearly as simple. You need to add many more bits to double that work factor. So to match each of one of these irrelevant increases in symmetric crypto sizes, you need a huge increase in asymmetric key sizes. So forget large size keys, you need ludicrous size keys in order to match these irrelevant increases in symmetric crypto. But there's an even better one than this. So the first quantum factorization was done in 2001. So it factored the number 15. That's not a 15-digit number. It's not a 15-bit number. It's the product of 3 times 5. So the same thing could be, someone commented that you can do the same thing with the dog trained to bark 3 times. So the next record was set in 2012. And this time they factored 21, 3 times 7. So you can use the same dog to match that. There's another attempt tried in 2019. They had a go at 35, 5 times 7, and it failed. Since then, there have been no new factorization records using Shor's algorithm. There have been a number of records announced for special case numbers, which I'll go into in a minute, but there have been no actual sort of legitimate factorizations. So the scientific breakthrough in all of these cases was in finding techniques to manufacture values that you could then factor with a physics experiment. So the standard technique for doing this is you manufacture a small value that you can factor with a physics experiment, and then in later papers, you figure out how to stretch them effectively indefinitely. There's a great paper called Pretending to Factor Large Numbers, where they demonstrate a technique where you can create a number of any size you want and then claim to have factored it. And these have been called stunt factorizations. There's a paper that I mentioned yesterday, Replication of Quantum Factorization Records with an 8-bit home computer, an abacus, and a dog, where myself and my co-author took these existing factorization records and replicated them on a VIC-20 home computer and an abacus. We wanted to use a ZX81, but that hasn't got enough. It's only got 1K of memory, and it can't store a 2048-bit key. So we had to go to a VIC-20, which has got 4K of memory, and then we can store the key. So even the factorization of the values 15 and 21 took advantage of special tricks. So they knew the result in advance. They knew the factors in advance, and this is called the compiled Shor's algorithm. So you already know the result you're supposed to get, and then you work backwards and design a physics experiment to get that result. And you know, there's a comment on this paper, Pretending to Factor Large Numbers, to say to even call such a procedure compilation is an abuse of language. But in any case, we've got the necessary 2 data points, so we can draw a line on a graph. So this is the graph from before, and you can see the data points on there. So we go to a bigger graph and to extrapolate and to get to the 1,000-bit key size, and by about the year 4000 AD, given the current rate of progress, we will be able to break one of these keys. So this makes the highly optimistic assumption that quantum physics experiments scale linearly. We have no evidence that this is the case. In fact, given the existing lack of progress, the evidence is that this is not the case, but we can extrapolate anyway. So basically, in 2,000 years, a physics experiment may be able to achieve what a conventional computer can do right now. Now, note that I've been using the term physics experiment rather than a computer. That's a physics experiment, that's not a computer. So claiming that it's a computer misrepresents what we're actually working with in the same way that compiled Shor's algorithm is, we know the answer in advance, misrepresents what you're doing. This is not a computer, it is a physics experiment. A computer takes input data, processes it, produces a usually novel result. A quantum computer, in inverted commas, takes a known fact, which is the 2 factors, and then creates a physics experiment to demonstrate it. So you already know the answer in advance, and then you create a physics experiment to produce the answer that you already know. This is not how code breaking works. So these are physics experiments, they are not computers. What this also means is that you can't really pop out keys like a production line. Each experiment, because these are physics experiments, you need a complex setup process to actually get them set up to run. So think ENIAC from 1945, not a current PC. ENIAC usually took about 2 weeks by a 6-programmer team to set up. In terms of physics experiments, no paper has ever mentioned what it takes to set up one of these things. We've got 0 data points to work with. The fact that usually it's only one single result presented rather than several indicates that it's a non-trivial amount of effort to set up, but no paper has ever actually said what it takes to set up one of these things. And again, see the earlier discussion on which keys are you actually going to expend the effort on. If you've got a $100 million physics experiment and it can recover a key in an hour, great, but if it takes 3 months to set up, it's kind of a limiting factor. So in 1999, Adi Amir, who is the S in RSA, actually created a physics-based factoring thing, a device called Twinkle, and then later on something called Twirl. However, he forgot to use the word quantum in the name, so no one noticed. But quantum cryptanalysis takes advantage of something called the Heisenberg-Schrödinger credulity effect. This is a cryptographer, John Callis, commented on this. He said, the word quantum sucks people's brains out, and otherwise sensible people suffer from impaired reasoning. Now, I reckon it should be called the Schrödinger-Heisenberg credulity effect with a metal umlaut, because we need more of those in crypto. But anyway, every time you see the word quantum computer, mentally substitute physics experiment, because that's what's actually being discussed. So here's an example of this in action. This is a Swedish tech firm, Bluefors, and they've signed a contract, $300 million, to mine helium-3 on the moon starting in 2 years from now. Now, this may sound like the plot for an Iron Sky sequel, but it is apparently legitimate. They're mining helium-3 on the moon. Okay, this is from a US Saturday Night Live sketch. I'm not sure how familiar this will be to an Australian audience. So how do you break crypto with a physics experiment? Well, this is based on the Underpants Gnomes business model. So you start with public key cryptography, then you have a working quantum factorization machine that goes there, and you profit. And this applies to lots of things. For example, you've got overpopulation on Earth. Well, a working faster than light drive goes here, profit. Go back and kill Hitler and Stalin, working time machine goes here, profit. Wolfgang Pauli, who was a quantum physics pioneer, would have absolutely loved this stuff. So he actually complained about people making these claims about, here is some magic, which I'm not going to explain to you. So this is a note he wrote sometime in the 1950s in response to some researchers doing this stuff. And I don't know if you can read the handwriting. This is to show the world I can paint like Titian. Only technical details are missing. Now, if he was alive today, that note would say, this is to show the world a quantum factorization machine. Only technical details are missing. So evidence for the Schrödinger-Heisenberg credulity effect. When you say working time machine goes here, you're obviously just being silly. But when you say working quantum factorization machine goes here, it's dead serious. So remember the factorization records I mentioned earlier? So they factored 2 carefully chosen numbers with the results known in advance. These are known as sleight of hand numbers or stunt factorizations. So to date, there's never been a single physics experiment factorization of a non-sleight of hand number. Again, show of hands, who was aware of this before now? A couple. Okay, well, now the rest of you know too. So basically, the sleight of hand stuff is the stock and trade of stage magicians. Standard card trick. Pick a card, any card. Then you have lots of smoke and mirrors to distract the audience, and then you say, is it the 5 of spades? Here's the quantum equivalent. Pick an integer greater than 14 and less than 16. Lots of smoke and mirrors to distract the audience, and then, is it 3 times 5? So it's only ever factored sleight of hand numbers. The example I gave earlier, there was a D-wave factorization of a 2048-bit RSA integer. So the trick they used here is that they took the 2 factors. So RSA, you take 2 very large prime numbers, multiply them together. They took these 2 very large numbers and made sure that the distance between them was either 2, so they were a prime pair, or 6. So you had to guess one single bit, and at that point you'd factored this 2048-bit number. In terms of RSA key generation, typically a standard requirement is that they differ by several hundred bits. So not 1 bit, but hundreds and hundreds of bits, because there was a factorization technique called Fermat's method for factorization, which is several hundred years old, which will very easily recover values if they're fairly close to the square root. So no RSA key would ever use anything like this. They basically cheated. So here's the best quantum factorization technique I know of, literally the most successful one. So these physics experiments have problems with decoherence, so you need lots and lots of error correction. So what you do, you set up your physics experiment, you don't bother with error correction, and you just keep rerunning it until you get the answer you want. So effectively, it's a random number generator. And there's a great quote from the paper that presented this. For small numbers, Shor's algorithm succeeds quickly regardless of how well your quantum computer works. To my knowledge, no one has cheated at factoring in this way before. So the thing is, this was a joke, but it was actually reduced to practice earlier this year. So there was a project called Project 11, And they awarded one Bitcoin, which last time I checked was about $80,000, to the most successful attack on elliptic curve cryptography, which is a slightly different problem than interfactorization. And someone recovered this key, and he got this $80,000 award. And then a cryptographer called Yuval Adam came along and unplugged the physics experiment and plugged in dev-random and got exactly the same results. So basically what they won a prize for is the best job of obfuscating the fact that the physics experiment wasn't doing anything. So if we exclude all the sleight of hand factorizations, our earlier graph simplifies to that. That's the data points we've got. We've actually got 0 data points, which is the same number of data points as we've got for faster than light travel and Star Trek style teleportation and all the other stuff. It's still a valid result. In science, negative results usually don't get published, but this is a valid negative result. It shows that we're not getting anywhere. So next time you see the latest announcement of a quantum breakthrough, don't say, we're all going to die. Say, where did they cheat this time? Or in fact, don't even bother doing that, because usually within a week or two, someone else will come along and say, yeah, this thing you've done over here, this really isn't quite right. So some counter-arguments to this. We're making incremental improvements on quantum factorization. So imagine you go to your boss and say, we've spent 25 years and burned $100 million and got absolutely nowhere, but we're making incremental improvements. Okay, you're now a US defense contractor. Another case of incremental improvements, about the year 120 AD, Legio IX Hispana vanished without a trace, better known as the Ninth Legion. And so we've been making incremental improvements for the last 2,000 years on trying to figure out what happened to these. So physics experiment-based factorizations only had about 25 years of incremental improvements. These guys have been incrementally improving for 2,000 years, and we've both made about the same amount of progress. Store now, decrypt later. So basically, the idea behind this is you store in 10 exabytes of encrypted data on a USB key, and in 30 years' time, you pull it out and decrypt it with a physics experiment. So this conveniently ignores the fact that you need to set up a fresh physics experiment for each key used. I've already mentioned it, that no paper ever mentions how long this takes. So the last figures I could find were from 2017, which said there were 7 trillion symmetric keys set up just for web traffic alone, not for encryption in general. This is a bit of a limiting factor. So the German government did a study where they estimated it would take about 100 days and 4 million euros in electricity to recover a single 2048-bit key on a physics experiment that doesn't exist. They actually said in there, we don't have one of these things, so we're sort of extrapolating and imagining that this thing exists. So it takes 100 days to recover one single key, and there's 7 trillion keys a year. I'll let you do the maths. But we'll ignore this because everyone else does too. It also ignores the fact that the keys of interest, so I've been talking about factorization, which is the RSA problem. Well, every cryptocalypse story talks about factorization. Well, all the protocols that are used, TLS, SSH, IPsec, WireGuard, Signal, everything pretty much, does not rely on factorization. It relies on a completely different problem called the discrete logarithm problem, or DLP. Completely different problem. So the quantocalypse stories are for factorization. The actual thing you need to attack is the DLP. And I don't know why everyone focuses on factorization. My theory is that it's much easier to cheat with factorization than it is with the DLP, so that's why everyone uses factorization. But we'll ignore this issue again, because everyone else does too. And finally, we'll ignore the fact that it only applies to data in flight, not data at rest. So data at rest is your databases and collections of email and everything else sitting on a hard drive or SSD. It's encrypted with symmetric encryption. There was a separate algorithm to break that called Grover's algorithm, which is so impractical, no one's even pretended to use that. But again, we'll ignore this. So, okay, what encrypted traffic today will actually be interesting in 30 years' time? Your online shopping orders, your bank statements, corporate sales strategies, share trading orders. What encrypted stuff will even be interesting tomorrow if it's instant messaging and stuff like that? And in particular, going pure, not hybrid. So there's 2 types of post-quantum encryption. I'll get into this in a minute. One of which is pure, so it's only post-quantum algorithms. The other one is hybrid, so you have post-quantum mixed in with non-post-quantum. So if one breaks, the other one's still safe. So if you're going with pure post-quantum only, you're gambling that someone will figure out how to make quantum stuff work in 30 years' time. Well, we've had 0 results after 25 years of effort, so good luck with that. The other one is you're gambling that these post-quantum algorithms and the way they're used are still secure after 30 years. Now, more than half of them have already been publicly broken, and there's presumably private breaks by government agencies that we don't know about, and we barely have any experience in the use. So these are pretty high-risk algorithms. So new research topic, figuring out where this stuff would actually apply. Another response is you're measuring it wrong. So I've been told that using the lack of progress to measure the lack of progress in quantum is actually the wrong metric. I need to use a metric where the number goes up. So one suggestion is the claimed qubit counts. Well, the problem is you can magic up pretty much any number you want with qubit counts, so it doesn't really count, but it does fulfill the requirement for a metric when number go up. But I suggested a different one. Use the number of conference papers and news stories with quantum in the title as your metric. And number go up, so progress. It's an excellent metric for evaluating the success of quantum. What if you're wrong? Well, wrong about what? There's a line on an RSA graph counting 0 results. I counted 0 results several times over. The weight of schwerer Gustav. This is not, this is not opinion stuff. It's a statement of known facts. I've got a lot of references at the end of the slides, so if you download the slides off my homepage, it'll list all the references that you can go and check. What if someone does create a quantum computer? This is hard to argue against. It's basically saying, what if the monsters are real? What if we really are being controlled by the lizard people? It's the argument of last resort when you've got nothing else. There's no evidence. It's just an appeal to emotion. So you've moved from evidence-based reasoning to just a hypothetical that can't be disproven. And it's very effective because there's no counter-argument. What about CRQCs? I don't know if you guys have heard of these. So this is a term, cryptographically relevant quantum computers. I don't know why this term is needed, because it implies that everything else is cryptographically irrelevant. But my suspicion is that by saying CRQC, you can get another 20 to 30 years out of it by giving it a new name. And then after 20 years, you can come up with yet another new name. And no, really, we mean it this time, quantum computers, and you start again. So when should we start worrying? Well, basically, once that becomes that, and there's no sign of that becoming that at the moment. So you've got post-physics experiment crypto. One option, and this is probably the one that everyone's going to use, is lattice-based cryptography. So there's ML-Chem for encryption and ML-DSA for signatures. Proposed about 30 years ago, never used. It just wasn't very good. It's incredibly inefficient. It's probably physics experiment proof unless someone says otherwise. Probably secure unless someone says otherwise. So of the algorithms, as of late 2023, so NIST ran a competition to choose a new algorithm for this. 48% of the initial candidates were broken. Of the ones that survived that, 25% were broken. Of the ones that survived the next round, another 36% were broken. And that's the public breaks. We don't know how many are broken by government agencies. Very little operation or experience with this. The most popular signature algorithm, ML-DSA, is absolutely riddled with side channels, which is basically vulnerabilities. There's a great paper on this which compared EC-DSA, the existing stuff, with ML-DSA. And they said there are so many side channels, so vulnerabilities in this, that it's easier to list the place that don't have vulnerabilities than the ones that do. ML-Chem has no firewall, so the standard encryption algorithms we're using, let's say ECDH, DH, 25519, and so on, you can screen the attacker's input. The attacker provides you something, and you do a whole bunch of checks on this. For example, for elliptic curve, is it the point at infinity, is it the point on the curve? A bunch of mathematical checks, and then it gets into your crypto. ML-Chem, there is no way of screening it. Your attacker has direct access to the internals of your crypto because you can't filter out suspicious values. So another thing is pure versus hybrid post-quantum stuff. So the governments really want us to use pure post-quantum. So only post-quantum algorithms, nothing else. So effectively it's saying we're putting all our eggs in one basket and hoping that the dial stops spinning it, not broken. And it increases your risk to SNDL, because if one of these things does get broken later, you're screwed. Everyone else is using hybrids, so you use post-quantum and non-post-quantum combined. So if one gets broken, the other one's still safe. And what that in effect is saying is that we trust this post-quantum stuff so little that we're requiring that you use the stuff that we claim is broken alongside it. Another thing with the pure is things like the NSA are really saying Simon says PQC. So if you look at the NSA's two main targets, which is Russia and China, they don't seem to be concerned about this at all. Russia's doing nothing, and China's been sort of a couple of months away from announcing some sort of post-quantum strategy for at least the last 5 years. So they're effectively doing nothing either. So I don't want to interpret anything into that, but that's just food for thought. So, okay, why are we fixated on this? So we've got a physics experiment that no one's managed to set up that's faking a solution to a problem, factorization, that's totally unrelated to the one that we want to solve, the discrete logarithm problem, which falls 2 trillion keys behind each time that it's used. So this is Scribble, and Scribble can bark 5 times, which currently makes him more capable than the world's most powerful factorization physics experiment. But that's been our reaction. So why are we fixated on this? Well, let's look at subprime mortgages. I won't go through all of this because it's such a long list, but basically house buyers were given essentially free houses, ninja mortgages, mortgage brokers were earning commissions, retail banks made money selling mortgages to investment banks, they had mortgage-based securities, insurance companies would insure them through credit default swaps, and credit ratings agencies were paid to bless the whole thing. So nobody in the entire food chain had any incentive to push the emergency stop. A lot of them could see that the crash was going to happen, but they were making so much money, there was no incentive to stop. So, pop quiz. Which one of these would you choose? If you're an academic, would you want to publish another paper on something that no one cares about, or publish a paper on a physics experiment? If you're a standards group, would you want to standardize away on some TLS extension that everyone will ignore, or fly from one exotic location to the next? There's a list there of the places that the IETF meets, and talk about post-quantum. If you're a developer, do you want to audit your code or work on some cool new algorithm? If you're a journalist, do you want to write about this week's PHP vulnerability or announce quantum supremacy for the 37th time in a row? And everyone's going to choose B because A is boring. A is the status quo. As with subprime mortgages, nobody has any incentive to stop the merry-go-round. If the merry-go-round stops, you have to go back to the OWASP top 10. Again, I'll skip this stuff. So the example of the fixation on this is exactly the same news story as reported by quantum and non-quantum media. So Quantum magazine, quantum publication, new quantum algorithm factors numbers with 1 qubit. Incidentally, in the notes at the end, there is a great video by an Australian physicist showing you how to build a 1 qubit computer, quantum computer on your kitchen table. Medium magazine said, the quantum factoring algorithm that requires the energy output of stars, a 77-page monument to missing the point. So that was exactly the same, or the coverage of exactly the same thing from a quantum magazine and a non-quantum magazine. And again, fixating on these unrealistic attacks draws resources away from solving the real problems that we're facing. And then this endless churn and complexity creates even more problems. And this is a great example of saying the quiet bits out loud. So future adoption of these algorithms is likely inevitable, even if quantum computer is never built, opening the door to decades of new research in cryptanalysis. So this is a cryptographer's wet dream. You've got decades of new research. The existing stuff is, AES, SHA-2, all the main stuff that we've been using now. This stuff's 20 years old. It's kind of not much is going on, whereas quantum, lots of stuff is going on. Again, I'll skip this bit. So, yeah, complexity is the enemy of security. Well, churn is complexity serialized. Standard complexity, you've got everything up front. With constant churn, you've got a red queen problem where more complexity is being added every time. So the TLS protocol alone has 60 RFCs. That's one single TLS protocol, 60 RFCs. And combined with the ones in draft, that's just under 2,000 pages of standards documents. There's going to be all sorts of problems in there. So it's the enemy of security. In fact, some of the most secure systems I've ever audited were created by non-security geeks. These are embedded systems engineers. Bare bones TCP stack, there's nothing there, no options, no fragmentation, nothing. TLS with one single cipher suite, no options. Certificate management was done via memcopy, it didn't even try and process them. There was nothing there to attack. So something similar to quantum cryptanalysis has happened in string theory. It's non-falsifiable, you can't generate any testable predictions. And it drew resources away from standard physics research into this more or less a dead end. And quantum cryptanalysis is the string theory of security. It's never generated a single testable prediction. It's never factored a single non-sleight of hand number. Damn, there's no audio. So that is a dog demonstrating quantum factorization. Unfortunately, there is no audio. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We do have some time for some questions.
Oh, okay.
I don't have any questions in the app, but does anyone want to fire up a hand and I'll run over to you?
I'm also happy to answer questions later outside because some of the questions I expect will be quite long and the answers will be even longer.
We'll get one question in. It's got to be all the way up the back though.
So my question is, even if quantum computers get built and they can break RSA, so we pretty much use RSA to establish a session. We're still encrypting everything using AES. And if the setup of the RSA TLS handshake is supporting perfect forward secrecy, would breaking RSA even put us in any threat of compromising the secrecy of our data? Because
It
they
wouldn't-
still need to break AES.
Well, it wouldn't, because so the RSA was the first algorithm that was used when it was called SSL, 25 odd years ago. Now everything uses Diffie-Hellman or elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, which is the DLP problem I mentioned, which is different from factorization. So the RSA keys are not used for encrypting anything. So if you manage to break a 2048-bit RSA key, it doesn't allow you to decrypt anything, because all of the protocols I listed, IPsec and WireGuard and SSH and so on and so forth, do not use RSA to establish the encryption key.
Well, thank you so much for coming down. It has been an absolutely amazing presentation. So this is a gift from OzCert for,
Cool.
Thank you for coming and presenting at the conference. And can I please get one more massive round of applause?